Hey. So I'm a pretty avid reader, but lately I've noticed that something has changed in my reading behavior. Maybe it's a product of my advanced age and maturity, maybe it's a product of the digital age, but lately, as I read, the texts suddenly start stacking or branching out on me, creating this complex web. I sit down to read one text, and it leads me forward and back to all these other texts. These texts multiply and grow on me as I read, and I start researching. A simple, single pronged reading project soon becomes this complex web of text. Here's a recent example I experienced when it comes to the work of H.P. Lovecraft. Howard Phillips Lovecraft is a writer who was especially prolific in the 1930s. He wrote weird fiction, horror, and science fiction, and was primarily published in pulp magazines. Since his death in 1937, his status and reader interest in his work has increased. Today, his influence is prevalent in the writing of other authors, as well as in film, video games, and throughout popular culture. In mid 2015, I was familiar with Lovecraft, but mostly by reputation and the few short works I'd read, like The Statement of Randolph Carter. It was actually a comic book that pulled me right down into the Lovecraft web. Providence is a comic series by Alan Moore and Jason Burrows. Named after Lovecraft's hometown, this maxi series from Avatar Press connected heavily to the entirety of Lovecraft's life work. It was slated for 12 issues, and like Moore's Watchmen, it featured sometimes lengthy prose material in the back matter of the comics. The depth of the research Alan Moore put into this new work was staggering, and after a few issues it was obvious that I'd have to pump the brakes and get more informed if I wanted to pick up everything he was putting down in this series. I made my way to a website called Facts in the Case of Alan Moore's Providence by Robert Deary, Joe Linton, and Alex Kay. This is an impressive annotation website, sort of like Genius.com, but full of detailed explanations for the comic that help explain all the illusions, analogs, and complex techniques at play. I worked through some of these and quickly realized that there were two prequel Lovecraftian comic runs by the same creative team, 2004's The Courtyard and 2012's The Neonomicon. I secured a collected edition of these. But I also learned that each issue of Providence was especially indebted to a specific Lovecraft story. Issue 1 alludes to Cold Air, for instance, while Issue 2 alludes to The Horror at Red Hook, and Issue 3 to The Shadow over Innsmouth. Then things started to get more complex, as multiple works and aspects of Lovecraft's own life were alluded to in a single issue. My initial method of sniping specific Lovecraftian short stories wasn't going to work for me, so I decided to read all of it. There are so many collections of H.P. Lovecraft's writing out there, so many anthologies, that when you're deciding on one, it can be a little bit overwhelming. But because I knew I wanted a complete collection, it made it a little bit easier. I decided on this hardcover slipcase edition from Race Point Publishing. It's a Knickerbocker edition, and it purports to be a collection of his complete works. It was released in 2014, and at a price of $30 or $40, it provides great value. We get a printed slipcase, a silky cloth cover to the volume, and heavy end papers. It's a quality binding, and it held up really well as I made my way through it. It presents the material chronologically, and it features 68 selections, ranging from fragments to short stories to novella-length fiction. The paper itself is a touch thin, but for a collection of over 1,000 pages, that's understandable. While some of the Dream Quest stuff was a bit hard to get through, I enjoyed most of what I read here. Cool Air, The Dunwich Horror, Hickman's Model, The Whisperer in Darkness, The Terrible Old Man, The Statement of Randolph Carter, The Color Out of Space, The Call of Cthulhu, and The Shadow over Innsmouth were all standouts. To supplement my reading, I found a great podcast called the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast at hppodcraft.com. This project was started back in 2009 by Chad Pfeiffer and Chris Lackey, and it also goes through Lovecraft's fiction chronologically. So as I finished reading each selection, I'd listen to an episode of the podcast as a sort of prize, and it was always rewarding. However, the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast also alerted me to the fact that there were other stories not included in the book, specifically Lovecraft's 34 collaborations. I learned that the author was also a prolific collaborator with other writers, so to source out these selections, I turned to another website, the H.P. Lovecraft Archive, which is a digital collection of all his writing, including these collaborations. So now I'm getting in pretty deep. Initially, I just wanted to read a 12-issue comic run. Then I had to circle back and read another couple comics. I put that on pause and read all 68 selections from the physical book, another 34 from the digital archive, and I'd listened to 120 episodes of the podcast. While I was grinding this all out, I also played some video games on the Switch, including 2018's The Call of Cthulhu and 2019's The Sinking City. At the same time, Nick Cage released his adaptation of The Color Out of Space, so I watched that movie too. Then I started hearing about Matt Ruff's 2016 novel, Lovecraft Country. I secured a copy and jumped in. The novel's made up of 8 chapters that each invoke different aspects of Lovecraft's fiction. Of course, the novel was adapted by HBO into a highly successful TV show, so I watched that too. After getting exposed to as much of the author's work as I could, and upon engaging with a bunch of the related texts, I was finally ready to return to Providence. By this time, the comic run had long since ended. While I think it holds up well enough on its own, I was truly able to appreciate the subtleties and complexity of this series after my multi-year deep dive into the world of Howard Phillips Lovecraft. It was one of the richest and most impressive comic book achievements I've ever come across. It's so very well researched and structured, and the creators ended up producing this wonderful tapestry of text that not only includes Lovecraft's fiction, but also includes the author and some of his contemporaries as characters. Even some of the critical and scholarly work around his writing is featured. So of course, that's where I ended up. Eventually, I started looking at the work of some of the Lovecraft scholars like S.T. Joshi, who shows up as a character towards the end of the comic series, and others like Robert M. Price. And that's how reading has changed for me. Instead of a single-pronged reading project, these days, it often evolves as related texts and media start stacking up and I get caught in the web. And I like it like that. I didn't always have the time or the means to fully explore the rich context and content around what I read, but now that I do, I recognize that it makes for a more engaging and immersive experience, especially when the content is as compelling as the work of H.P. Lovecraft.